In this presentation, we're going to get up and running with Playmaker. We'll go through the procedure of installing and activating and utilizing Playmaker as an alternative to writing scripts from the ground up. So in the previous presentation, we created this rotate JavaScript. I have a preview of it here. We selected the cube and dragged the rotate script onto the cube. We've modified the script a bit. When we hit the play button, the script is actually driving the rotation. With the cube selected, if I want to get rid of that rotate script, all I have to do is just remove that component. So I find the rotate script component, I'll click on the little cog to the right and choose to remove component. Now that script has been removed. We still have access to the script in the asset folder. We created a scripts folder, and if we want to add that asset again, we can drag and drop onto the cube. And of course we can add that script to any game object inside the scene. But we're going to utilize Playmaker and kind of compare and contrast the workflow that we created from the previous presentation. So in order to get Playmaker up and running, we would have had to have purchased it from one of two places. We can get it from the asset store or the developer website, Hutong Games. I'm going to jump into the asset store by going to Window Assets. Once I'm logged in, once you're logged in, you can go to the download bin, to download manager here, and look for Playmaker. Click the download button. I've already downloaded mine, so it's up to date. There's a local package that's up to date, and once that's the case, I can click the import button. Now, when we hit import, there's a couple of steps that we need to go through. The first one is we're going to import. We're going to do the initial import of the Playmaker installer. So it'll take a moment for that to decompress the assets. And now I want to hit install Playmaker. Now, once we click install Playmaker, a README document pops up. I'm going to close that window just so we can focus on this next window. So we've chosen to install. And then this brings us to an installation window, and we can either run a pre-update check, which in this case we don't need to do that, and we'll just choose to install. So this is the second time I'm hitting the install button from this Playmaker splash screen. So I've downloaded the Playmaker asset from the asset store. I chose to import. I've hit install in the first pop-up window that came up, and that presented me with a new pop-up window, and I'm choosing install again. I need to acknowledge that I've made a backup or tell it to go ahead. I'll choose go ahead. So whenever we import a third-party asset, we often get warned to back up our project. And once we import it, these are the assets that we're going to import into our project. So I'm going to hit import again. Now, once I go through the import process, it's going to take a minute to unpack it, all of the assets and utilities that Playmaker needs to run. So it's going to take a minute for this to happen. And we might get prompted again that we need to update an API or run a process. And I want to make sure that I don't want to cancel any of the windows that pop up. Now, it is important that if we have, if we're far along in a project development cycle, I'll say okay. If we're working on a major project and we're importing a third-party asset somewhere in production, we want to make sure that we back up our projects, because it is possible that some of the architecture that we develop might not be compatible with the asset that we're importing. In this case, we have nothing to worry about. And so Playmaker finished its installation process. So at this point, I have this splash screen that's popping up that every time I launch my project, this window will pop up. And there is some valuable information in here. There's some basic tutorials. There's some documentation. And this will start up every time that we launch this project. I'm going to close that window. Now, I have Playmaker installed. Unity is going to look just the same until we configure it. And you will notice that you have a Playmaker window now, a Playmaker drop-down menu option inside the application menu. So if I click on Playmaker, I have some new options available here. And we want to make available two windows, and this is where most of the magic's going to happen in Playmaker. I'm going to click on the Playmaker window. The first one is the Playmaker editor. So you'll see that when I pull up the Playmaker editor, I get this little splash screen again. So I'm going to uncheck Show at Startup and close that window. This is the Playmaker editor. It's floating here in space. And now this Playmaker editor, like any window that is floating, if I click on my scene view or I click on hierarchy or inspector, I lose focus of that floating panel. So I'm going to go back to Playmaker, Playmaker editor. And so I'm going to nest the Playmaker editor because we're going to spend a lot of time looking at this window. I'm going to grab the tab of Playmaker, and I'm going to drag this. And where I like to station this is kind of to the right of my project panel. So I can still see my project assets and all of its contents. I'll drag this over just a bit, but now I can focus on my Playmaker editor window. And we'll take a tour of the entire Playmaker editor here in just a moment, but this is kind of the primary window we'll be editing all of our logic. Now, the other window that's going to be important for us to focus on is the Playmaker editor window, the action browser. So I'm choosing Playmaker, editor windows, action browser. And this gives us a list of all of the actions or of the library of scripts that we can access through Playmaker. And I'm just going to nest that to the right of my inspector so I can see the actions window and still have focus of my inspector. Now, if you're working on a low-res screen or a small footprint screen, you can nest your actions behind the inspector so that you can just kind of switch back and forth between the two. But for the sake of this demo, I'm going to keep mine parked to the right of my inspector. Okay. So that's a high-level overview of installing and configuring Playmaker in the Unity workspace. Now, if you purchase Playmaker directly through the developer website, the only difference in from the demonstration that I gave is that rather than downloading and importing Playmaker from the asset store, you would download Playmaker from the link that Hutong Games provided to you. Once you download the assets that they provided to you and unzip the archive, you can choose the Assets pull-down menu, Import Package, and choose Custom Package. I've saved the Playmaker download on my desktop and unzipped it. And you just need to install the latest version, which is Unity 5.4, followed by the version of Playmaker. So you'd choose that asset, hit open, and then you'd go through the same procedure that I demoed at the beginning of this video. So take some time, download Playmaker, install it, and activate it, organize it inside your Unity interface in a similar way that I have here. And in our next presentation, we'll emulate the same thing that we did with the rotate script. We'll get our game object to rotate and then do a few other things, but we'll do that using Playmaker, and we'll kind of talk about that process and workflow of Playmaker. But we'll do that in the next presentation.